The Caretakers of the Cosmos, Living Responsibly in an Unfinished World, written by Gary Lachman, narrated by Russell Newton. In the beginning was the Spill, at least according to the account of creation given by Isaac Luria, the great Kabbalist of Safed, in the 16th century in what was then Ottoman-controlled Palestine. What exactly I mean by spill will be explained shortly. Kabbalah is a Hebrew word meaning receiving and is the name given to the mystical tradition within Judaism. Kabbalah claims to explain the nature of the universe and man's place within it, just as the Hermetic writings do, and is said to be the esoteric or inner teaching hidden within the exoteric or outer reading of the Torah. Perhaps its most well-known feature is the Atz Chim, or Tree of Life, a symbolic mapping of the divine energies at work in the world, with its 10 Sephiroth, or vessels, which has become almost as ubiquitous in popular occultism as the tarot, with which it is often associated. Erroneously, it seems, as most Judaic scholars argue. At Kabbalah's heart is the relation between creation, the finite, physical cosmos, and its infinite, unmanifest source, called the Ein Sof, which means limitless or unending. This is a sphere or dimension of what we can call negative existence, which really means that it's a plane of reality that our finite human minds are incapable of comprehending, and not merely a simple emptiness. The Ein Sof is so other than what we normally perceive as reality that we cannot make positive statements about it. Any positive statement about it would, by definition, be a limit on it, and as it is limitless, cannot apply. This negative existence has parallels in other spiritual traditions. It is the neti-neti, not this, not that, of Hinduism, the sunyata, or void, of Buddhism, the pleroma of the Gnostics. It's even part of the Christian faith. The Athanasian Creed, in use in Western Christianity since the 6th century, declares that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are uncreated and unlimited, and in more than one place in Scripture, we're told that God has neither body nor parts. It's at the heart of the negative theology of Meister Eckhart, forms the Ungrund of Jacob Boehm's difficult alchemical writings, and can be found in the Nichts, or positive nothingness, of Martin Heidegger's fundamental ontology and his predecessor Hegel's tortuous dialectic. In more scientific terms, a similar idea, but without the spiritual connotations, seems to be present in the way scientists talk about the state of things before the Big Bang. I put before in quotation marks because, according to most accounts, there was no before the Big Bang, a confusing situation to be sure. A kind of non-manifest ground of our everyday reality also seems to be involved in the implicate order of the physicist David Bohm. There are other expressions of the idea, but I think this will suffice for now. Just as the Hermetic teachings are supposed to have been revealed to Hermes Trismegistus at the dawn of time, Kabbalah said to have been revealed to Adam in the beginning in Eden. But as with the Corpus Hermeticum, a more wieldy dating for its conception is available. Historically, Kabbalah comes to light in the 12th and 13th centuries in Spain and southern France, emerging from earlier forms of Jewish esotericism, such as the Merkaba, or throne, or chariot mysticism, that centers on the vision of a mystical chariot in Ezekiel. The Zohar, one of the most important texts in Kabbalah, was said to have been discovered in 1286 by Moses de Leon, a 13th century Spanish Kabbalist. Leon claimed that it was written in 2nd century Israel by the miracle-working Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but most modern scholars believe it was written by Leon himself. Although mainstream Judaism considers Kabbalah nonsense, it's at the center of Hasidic Judaism, the more ecstatic form of the faith. Isaac Luria. Isaac Luria is considered the father of contemporary Kabbalah, and it is his interpretation of the mystical tradition that concerns us here. A story has it that one day Isaac's father, an Ashkenazi Jew, was in the synagogue in Jerusalem, where Isaac was born, studying, when he was visited by the prophet Elijah. He told him that he would have a son who would deliver Israel from the Qliphoth, shells, or forces of evil, and transmit to the faithful their tikkun, reparation, and that he would make clear many of the mysteries of the Torah and explain the secrets of the Zohar. The story is most likely apocryphal, but it sums up Luria's short life admirably. By the age of 22, Luria had become devoted to the study of Zohar, which had only recently been printed for the first time. He became a hermit, living for 7 years on the banks of the Nile in a small cottage. During this time, he saw his family, he was by then married, only on the Sabbath, and had taken a vow of silence, speaking only when necessary, even to his wife. Legend has it that during his solitude, he was visited on more than one occasion by Elijah, who tutored him in the mysteries. In Safed in 1570, Luria became a student of the Kabbalist Moses Cordovero, 1522 to 1570, author of Pardes Ramonin, or Garden of Pomegranates, an attempt at a systematic presentation of the Kabbalistic philosophy, linking it to previous teachings and trying to bring different variants together into a coherent whole. Considered a classic and standard text, its presentation was only superseded by Luria's own ideas. Luria's tutelage under Cordovero lasted only a short while, a few months at best, and when Cordovero died, the circle of students looked for new guidance. Their search didn't take them very far, and Luria accepted the role as teacher. Elijah's prophecy, apocryphal or not, seemed to be coming true, and for the remaining 2 years of his life, Luria laid down the groundwork of a new reading of the Revelations. Luria himself did not write much. His literary remains consist of a few poems, but after his death, his ideas were disseminated by his disciple Chaim Vital, 1543 to 1620, who played a kind of Plato to Luria's Socrates, making notes of his lectures and compiling these into books, such as the 8 volumes of his Otz Chaim. It was through Vital's efforts that Luria's vision achieved the prominence it has. Tzimtzum. Luria's revisioning of Kabbalah came about because of problems in answering certain basic questions, such as how God, or the Ein Sof, which is infinite, could create a finite world like our own. A similar and related conundrum is how God, who is all good, could create a world like ours that contains evil. Luria's answer was ingenious. Luria came up with the concept of Tzimtzum, which means concealment and contraction. According to Luria, in order to create our world, the universe, God had to withdraw or contract a part of his infinite being to create, as it were, a hole in himself within which a void or empty space could exist. We can then think of our entire universe as a kind of hole in God, and as our universe is, by our standards, fairly large, just how large we will soon see, we can understand why the Kabbalists believe that trying to grasp the reality of the Ein Sof might be beyond our powers. Once the Tzimtzum created the void, Adam Kadmon, the primordial man, appeared. This idea of an archetypal human form, which is itself the universe, can be found in other spiritual traditions. Swedenborg, for example, speaks of the Grand Man, an idea that was carried on by his erstwhile disciple William Blake, 1757 to 1827, who speaks of the human form divine. The Hindu Vedas speak of Purusha, or cosmic man, from whose body the world is created. The basic idea is that the universe itself is ultimately in the shape or form of man, a very early form of what today we call the anthropic cosmological principle, the idea that, as mentioned earlier, the universe is designed in such a way that it will bring about the creation of intelligent life. Out of the eyes, nose, mouth, and ears of Adam Kadmon came flashing lights, emanations of the divine creative energies. These formed the Sephiroth, or vessels designed to contain these energies, as well as the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the holy Odiyat Yasod, or spiritual building blocks of creation. Much as the Greek philosopher-mystic Pythagoras believed that the world was made literally of numbers, the Kabbalists believe it was made out of the Hebrew alphabet. As in many spiritual traditions, in Kabbalah, words and language have mystical powers, and this is why the true name of God is never to be pronounced. Instead, it is referred to as the Tetragrammaton, the YHVH, or Jehovah of convention. Were God's true name spoken, it would, Kabbalah tells us, destroy the world. When the vessels break. The vessels designed to hold the divine energies and archetypal forms with which the Ein Sof will create the world proved unable to contain them. Just as an electrical transformer can hold only so strong a current, the Sephiroth could not withstand the terrific power coursing through them. What happened then is known as the Shevrat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. Kelim is another word for vessel. In this cosmic catastrophe, the vessels shatter, and the divine energies are scattered throughout the void. In one version, the divine energies are seen as waters flowing from heaven. The vessels aren't deep enough to contain the waters, and so they spill out into the emptiness, creating literally a holy mess. Hence the opening sentence of this chapter. The sacred letters of the alphabet are also jumbled into a confusing nonsense. A tear appears in the seamless void, and the unified divine forces separate into their opposites, male and female, causing a fracture in God and the primordial man. In the words of Gershom Scholem, the most respected Judaic scholar of the last century, following the Shevarat HaKalim, nothing remains in its proper place, and everything is somewhere else. That somewhere else is our world. As shards from the broken vessels fall, they capture sparks of the divine light, and these sparks sink into layers of darkness, much like the grim darkness of the Hermetic account. Tumbling into Sitra Achra, the other side, the universe as we know it, the shards come together to form husks or shells known as Klipoth, a kind of negative version of the Sephiroth, something like a Kabbalistic antimatter. Their designations as husks and shells suggest their empty character. The result of the breaking of the vessels is that the world, which the Ein Sof had originally planned to be formed of the highest values, beauty, love, mercy, wisdom, knowledge, is now corrupted by their evil counterparts. And we, too, who are fragments of the androgynous primordial man, are infected with the corruption. The Klipoth that make up the universe are in us, too, and we find ourselves here, separated into opposites, male and female, stranded on the other side. Hence, our world is one of pain, suffering, falsehood, conflict, and the other evils we are all too familiar with. Tikkun. This depressing state of affairs is reminiscent of the Gnostic view of ourselves as trapped in an evil world devised by an idiot god. But, as in the Hermetic account, all is not lost. Luria's dramatic version of the creation story and its subsequent cosmic catastrophe would be a paranoid's dream, or nightmare, if it were not for the possibility that the situation can be saved. In this, man plays the central role. If in the Hermetic creation myth we're caretakers of the world, for Lurianic Kabbalah, we are its cosmic repairman, here to clean up the mess caused by the spilling of the divine energies. Although the Klipoth are within us, as in the Hermetic account, we also carry within us sparks of the divine energies. In fact, everything in the world has within it some heavenly spark. Mankind's job is to free the sparks, netzotzim, from the shards, through what Luria called tikkun, or repair. Through this, we will restore the shattered Sephiroth, heal the rift between the opposites, and unify the polarized masculine and feminine aspects of God. The German Jewish cultural philosopher Walter Benjamin, 1892 to 1940, combined a deep interest in Kabbalah with a commitment to Marxism. In one of his most well-known essays, Benjamin wrote of what he called the angel of history. Where we perceive the past as a chain of separate events, the angel, Benjamin tells us, sees it as one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage. This single catastrophe is the result of the breaking of the vessels, and it takes place throughout history, here, on the other side. Benjamin had hopes that a kind of Marxist redemption would save the world, and make whole what has been smashed, yet ultimately he despaired and committed suicide while trying to escape the Nazis. Luria and the Kabbalists who followed him believe that we can stop the catastrophe and make whole what has been smashed, but he didn't think, as Benjamin did, in terms of some messianic event, a revolution, or even divine intervention that would finally stop the wreckage from piling up. His approach was more individual. He believed that in our lives, we encounter those trapped sparks, whether in people, nature, or inanimate things, which we are uniquely qualified to liberate, just as we encounter people in situations that can help liberate our own sparks. By doing this, we repair the universe. But equally so, our failure to perform tikkun only increases the world's confusion. This being so, mankind had a crucial role to play in the world. As Sanford L. Draub, a contemporary Kabbalist, writes, the restoration and repair of the broken vessels is largely in the hands of humankind. As mentioned, for some Kabbalists, God, or the Ein Sof, shattered the vessels on purpose, precisely so that man could repair them. But in this version, our work is more than repair. In freeing the divine sparks from the Qliphoth, Draub writes, and restoring them to God, and reestablishing the flow of masculine and feminine divine energies, man acts as a party in the creation and redemption of the world, and is actually said to complete God himself. Not only are we entrusted with the responsibility of saving the universe, but, as mentioned earlier, God too. It's a big world, after all. We will return to tikkun and how we can clean up the cosmic mess we find ourselves in. Right now, let's take a closer look at that hole in God we call the universe. What is it like on the other side? At the risk of pummeling the reader into submission with numbers, let me relate some facts and figures about the place we call home. According to the latest estimate, the observable universe seems to be a sphere of about 93.2 billion light-years in diameter. That gives it a radius of roughly 46.6 billion light-years. A light-year, we know, is the distance that a beam of light can travel in a year. Light travels at 186,000 miles per second, so a light-year equals roughly 6 trillion miles, or just short of 10 trillion kilometers. A trillion is a 1 followed by 12 zeros. 1 light-year is a 6 followed by 12 zeros. 6 trillion times 93 billion would give us the diameter of the observable universe in miles, or roughly 558, with 22 zeros following it. I say the observable universe because, although the portion of the universe that we can actually observe through the Hubble and other powerful telescopes is large, according to the latest estimates, it's only a fraction of the entire universe. That's assuming there is an entire universe, meaning a single, definite object that we could in some way see as a whole, a proposition that itself entails dizzying logical problems. We do not know if the rest of the universe, which we can't observe, ends in some way, or if it simply carries on into infinity. But either proposition is, like the Ein Sof itself, unthinkable for us. Exactly why there is an observable and unobservable universe is complex, but for our purposes, we can say that there is reason to believe that there are objects in the universe so distant from us and traveling away from us at such a speed, our universe, we know, is expanding, that their light will never reach us. It's not a question of our instruments not being powerful enough. The restrictions of time and space themselves and the conditions set by the proposed Big Bang make it impossible for us to ever detect these objects. One estimate of the size of the total universe, provided by the cosmic inflation theory of Alan Guth, gives us a figure of 10 to the 23rd times larger than the observable universe. I will not burden the reader with the number of zeros that gives us. The cosmological principle, which goes back to Isaac Newton, tells us that there is no privileged position within the universe from which to observe it, meaning that from any point in the universe looks pretty much the same, in whatever direction an observer may observe it. Given that the notion of an observable universe is true from any point within it, it is not a measurement of distance itself, but of how much of the universe can be observed from any point within it, and the much larger total universe that lies beyond the observability barrier. It seems that the old definition of God as a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere, takes on new meaning. Each of us is a center of the observable universe, and were we to travel half the distance to its edge, we would still be a center of the observable universe. Only the parts of the universe we could observe would have changed. Estimates for the number of stars within the observable universe vary from 3 to 100 times 10 to the 22nd, or 30 sextillion to 1 septillion, with an estimated 80 to 200 billion galaxies. This, of course, is only a fraction of the number of stars and galaxies there may be in the total universe. Within the observable universe, of the largest objects so far detected, we find what is called the Great Wall, a sheet or chain of galaxies known as a galactic filament, more than 500 million light-years long and 200 million wide. An even larger structure is the Sloan Great Wall, so named because it was discovered by J. Richard Gott III and Mario Jurich in 2003, using data from the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. It is 1.37 billion light-years long, more than twice the size of the Great Wall. Another large structure is known by the curious name of Newfound Blob, and gigantic gas bubbles that measure some 200 million light-years in length. There's also what is known as the Great Attractor, another large object, some 150 million light-years in size, that is pulling our galaxy and the rest of our local group, which includes Andromeda, the galaxy closest to the Milky Way, toward the constellation Leo at a speed of 400 miles per hour. Beyond these, no larger structures have yet been discovered, giving rise to what is called the end of greatness, a phrase that oddly parallels the fallacy of insignificance with which this book is concerned. At the opposite end from these colossal objects are the voids, stretches of the universe which seem empty of any galaxies, like gigantic cosmic vacant lots. Large voids are called supervoids, and galaxies that find themselves inhabiting a void are called void galaxies. They are the hermits of the universe, galactic recluses, living lonely existences in what seems sheer empty space. Most galaxies are apparently more gregarious, existing as part of a cluster, filament, wall, or sheet. I say the void galaxies exist in empty space, but apparently this is not exactly true, as what appears to us as empty space is, according to the latest findings, really full of what is called dark matter, mentioned earlier in relation to the grim darkness of the Hermetic creation myth. It's unclear exactly what dark matter is, but the universe seems full of it. In fact, all of the matter and energy in the known observable universe only accounts for 5% of the mass of the cosmos. The other 95% is missing. Dark matter and its counterpart dark energy, as well as the equally mysterious power of nothing, seem to confirm what mystics and occultists have been saying for centuries, that the universe, observable or otherwise, teems with unseen occult forces. Big bangs of nothing. And if the universe is big, it is also old. 13.75 billion years at the latest estimate, although some suggest 15 billion. It began in what is known as the Big Bang, a kind of holy grail of modern cosmology, although to some physicists, the theory is not entirely unassailable. Unshakable or not, it is curious that in at least 3 different creation myths, the scientific, the Hindu, and the Christian, and there may be more, sound plays a central role. In the Gospel of John, we're told that, "In the beginning was the Word." For Hindus, in the beginning was Om, the sacred, mystic syllable. But leave it to us moderns to start off with a bang. The vessels did shatter, after all. Although current theory takes us to 10 to the negative 37 seconds into it, an unimaginably brief stretch of time which, we're told, like space, didn't exist until the Big Bang, we still don't know exactly what triggered the bang. Although many scientists like to say that we're closing in on the secret of the universe, witness the recent excitement about the mysterious Higgs boson particle, any theories about why the bang happened at all remain speculative. If we ask obvious questions, such as what was before the Big Bang, scientists shake their heads and explain that we can't ask that because, as mentioned earlier, according to them, there was no before. There was also no where for the Big Bang to happen, as both time and space began with it. Yet, as the literary philosopher George Steiner argues, it is intellectually, possibly morally dishonest to rule by magisterial fiat that any questions as to time prior to the Big Bang is illegitimate nonsense. It's doubtful, however, if many scientists consider this. The physicist Stephen Hawking tells us that our universe came into being through a quantum fluctuation in a pre-existent vacuum, which, for non-physicists like myself, can perhaps best be understood as a kind of ripple in nothing. As the world's media announced a few years back, there was no need for God to create the world, as in his book The Grand Design, 2010, Hawking had made clear that spontaneous creation was all that was necessary to get things going. The universe had apparently created itself, truly a creation ex nihilo. Hawking's earlier goal of coming up with a theory of everything that would tie existence up into a neat bundle and leave no unanswered questions, thus making us privy to the mind of God, had it seemed now been trumped by a theory of nothing. Nothing had started the universe, he assures us, and there seems to be nothing we can do about it. It is perhaps from conclusions like these that the astrophysicist Steven Weinberg arrived at his famous pronouncement that the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. But once that nothing got going, boy, was it something. Beginning in an infinitesimally small, extremely hot, incredibly dense state, it, whatever it was, burst into the mother of all explosions, literally. If the enormous size of the universe and of some of the objects in it, as well as the number of them, seems overwhelming, there is equal mystery in the other direction, something the 16th century French mathematician and religious thinker Blaise Pascal, 1623 to 1662, recognized when he remarked that man finds himself between two infinities, the infinitely large and the infinitely small. Is it possible for us to in any way appreciate 10 to the negative 37th seconds? In between the time you read that question and consider it, the universe, according to the inflationary theory, had inflated, like a character's head in a cartoon, by a factor of 10 to the 50th, possibly 10 to the 78th, from less than nothing to a very big something. When this inflation stopped, the fledgling universe then consisted of quark-gluon plasma, or a quark soup, quarks being perhaps the most fundamental element in subatomic particles, their odd name borrowed from James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, 3 quarks for muster mark, by the physicist Murray Gell-Mann, their discoverer. Gluons are particles that hold the quarks together, and plasma is sometimes called the fourth state of matter, to differentiate it from solids, liquids, and gases. A plasma is a gas at such a high temperature that outer electrons are stripped from the atoms, producing clouds of positively charged nuclei and negatively charged electrons. Although plasmas exist on Earth only under laboratory conditions, most of the matter in the universe, in the atmosphere of stars, and in interstellar space, is in a plasma state, except, of course, for dark matter. We don't know what state it is in. It is a curious feature of quantum physics and modern cosmology that many scientists within the fields give new entities rather whimsical names: quarks, newfound blob, a somewhat geeky habit that accounts for the notion of a theory of everything that would fit on a t-shirt. After some 380,000 years, the exploding incandescent universe cooled. For some still unknown reason, more matter than antimatter was created, a glitch in Big Bang theory which actually suggests that equal amounts of matter and antimatter should have been created. What we know as the matter in the universe is really the extra matter left over, after the original matter and antimatter particles annihilated each other. Were it not for this excess matter, nothing would exist. In Kabbalistic terms, we can say that there were more kernels than husks left over after the vessel shattered. As the universe continued to cool, It produced particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons that fused to form the earliest elements, hydrogen and helium, with lithium running a close third. Clouds of these gases condensed through gravity to form our stars and galaxies, and something known as symmetry breaking put the fundamental forces of physics in place. Elementary particles reach their present form, with heavier elements being created within stars and supernova, the spectacular death of a star when it literally burns itself out in a terrific explosion. Give life a chance. According to the latest estimates, our Earth itself formed some 4.5 billion years ago, roughly 10 billion years after the Big Bang, from cosmic dust and gas left over from the Sun's formation. It is believed life appeared on Earth within a billion years after our planet formed. The standard account of the birth of life suggests that self-replicating molecules accidentally emerged from the primordial soup some 3.5 billion years ago, and through an equally accidental process, over millions of years, eventually turned into myself writing these words and you reading them, with, of course, quite a few different organisms in between. As with the Big Bang, the emergence of life is another example of the something from nothing for no reason scenario popular with many scientists today. According to the same scenario, the consciousness I am exhibiting in writing these words, humble indeed, and which you are employing in reading them, also emerged purely through accident, as an epiphenomenon of purely physical interactions of our brain's neurons, which are themselves the result of the purely mechanical process of evolution, the Darwinian version. An epiphenomenon is a kind of sideshow to the main attraction. Steam is an epiphenomenon of boiling water. It has no existence in itself, and without the boiling water, there would be no steam. For many neuroscientists and philosophers of mind today, our consciousness is little more than a kind of steam given off by the brain. To dot the I's and cross the T's on this, let me say it in the simplest way possible. According to the most commonly accepted scientific view, no one wanted the Big Bang to happen. No one wanted the Earth to form. No one wanted life to appear on the Earth, and no one wanted life to evolve into us. There's no reason for any of it. It just happened. This is a conclusion that the French Nobel Prize-winning scientist Jacques Monod, 1910 to 1976, one of the fathers of molecular biology, put perhaps more eloquently. Monod writes that chance alone is at the source of every innovation, of all creation in the biosphere. Pure chance, absolutely free but blind, at the very root of this stupendous edifice of evolution. This central concept of modern biology is no longer one among other conceivable hypotheses. It is today the sole conceivable hypothesis, the only one that squares with observed and tested fact. And nothing warrants the supposition, or the hope, that on this score our position is ever likely to be revised. The universe was not pregnant with life, nor the biosphere with man. Our number came up in the Monte Carlo game. From this insight, which is radically opposed to any kind of anthropic principle, Monod developed a rather bleak picture of our position in the world. Man, he tells us, at last knows he is alone in the unfeeling immensity of the universe, out of which he has emerged only by chance. His destiny is nowhere spelled out, nor is his duty. The kingdom above or the darkness below, it is for him to choose. Although his countryman Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905 to 1980, the most well-known existentialist, had a low opinion of science. According to his lover Simone de Beauvoir, Sartre flatly refused to believe in science and believed that microbes and other animalculae invisible to the naked eye didn't exist. He nevertheless agreed with Monod on at least this proposition. For Sartre, man has existence but no essence. His destiny is nowhere spelled out, nor is his duty, and is ultimately a useless passion. Like Monod, Sartre believed that we must face this grim situation stoically and make the best of it, but there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. Suffice it to say, neither Monod's views nor Sartre's is one that sits well with our being caretakers or repairmen of the cosmos. matters dark and meaningless. Aptly, one character who shares Monod's gloomy vision of a chance-ridden universe and of ourselves as purposeless creatures within it is the American horror fiction writer H.P. Lovecraft. Although Lovecraft was not a scientist, he was, though, a keen amateur astronomer. Throughout his short life, he professed an astringently materialist view of life and the cosmos. To a correspondent, Lovecraft wrote, "I am an absolute skeptic and materialist, and regard the universe as a wholly purposeless and essentially temporary incident in the ceaseless and boundless rearrangements of electrons, atoms, and molecules which constitute the blind but regular mechanical patterns of cosmic activity. Nothing really matters, and the only thing for a person to do is to take the artificial and traditional values he finds around him and pretend they are real, in order to retain that illusion of significance in life which gives to human events their apparent motivation and semblance of interest." Note that for Lovecraft, we maintain our illusion of significance by maintaining values that are artificial and which we only pretend to be real. For anyone who embraces the belief that pure chance is responsible for our existence, and that includes quite a few of the most prestigious minds of our times, it logically follows that nothing really matters, as our actions can have absolutely no effect, one way or the other. It is difficult to see how values like love, freedom, truth, justice, beauty, and others that we hold give meaning to life, can have emerged from an existence accounted for by the blind but regular mechanical patterns of electrons, atoms, and molecules, a vision of things that goes back to the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers Democritus and Leucippus. In such a world, values can have only a subjective and consensual experience, as fictions we agree on maintaining, as the only real things are purely physical and, so far as we know, beauty, love, and other values are not made of atoms or molecules. If values are real, they exist in some non-physical kind of reality, of the kind Plato had in mind when he spoke of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Although the conclusion that the values which give life meaning are really illusions follows from the premise that chance is responsible for life in the universe, it rarely gets mentioned by the scientists who accept that premise. Most of Lovecraft's weird fiction, of which I am a great fan, was published in the pulp horror magazines of the 1920s and 30s, of which Weird Tales is the best known. But while other Weird Tales writers like Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan, and Clark Ashton Smith still have readers, I myself am occasionally one of them, Lovecraft's frankly overwritten stories acquired a serious critical cachet denied his friends and colleagues. Perhaps understandably, this critical importance was first recognized in the 1950s by the French, who, a century earlier, had embraced Edgar Allan Poe, a major influence on Lovecraft, when he was ignored by his fellow Americans. Lovecraft's acceptance by the French, I would argue, has something to do with the bleak vision his stories portray, which is, in essence, the same as that of Sartre's grim philosophy and Monod's biological lottery. It is this atmosphere of existential dread, of some dark and terrifying knowledge breaking into our consciousness, that gives Lovecraft's tales a flavor as unmistakable as Kafka's, and which he shares with Sartre, whose existentialism Lovecraft would no doubt have turned his nose up at. For both the protagonists of Lovecraft's stories and Sartre's novels, knowledge is a trigger for a cosmic pessimism. Nausea. For Sartre, this cosmic pessimism is the nausea of his most famous work, his first novel, Nausea, 1938, which I first read as a teenager. The hero of this novel has come to the startling recognition that things exist, but their existence has nothing to do with him or with the stories or ideas he tells or has about them. They exist aggressively, in their own right. The names and categories and meanings we usually use to understand them, tree, stone, cloud, star, are simply falsehoods we tell in order to keep their strangeness at bay. But now he knows, and the knowledge paralyzes him. At one point in the novel, Roquentin, the protagonist, looks at the root of a chestnut tree and is perplexed by it. "I no longer remembered that it was a root," he tells us. Its existence frightens him. Like everyone else, he had taken existence for granted, and now it suddenly presses in upon him. It has lost its harmless appearance as an abstract category. It had become the very paste of things, and he cannot get away from it. At another point in the novel, he's about to open a door when he looks at the strange thing in his hand and has no idea what it is. It was the doorknob. Sartre's nausea is not unlike states of mind associated with schizophrenia, when the connection between perception and feeling is unhinged. It is also suggestive that much of the inspiration for nausea came from a bad mescaline trip Sartre had in 1936, in which he was attacked by devilfish and followed by an orangutan, in which umbrellas turned into vultures and shoes into skeletons. The misanthropic cosmological principle. Lovecraft's protagonists are also discomfited by knowledge, but while for Sartre a root or a doorknob spells doom, Lovecraft's dark insights are occasioned by more eccentric items. What knowledge means for Lovecraft can be best expressed by quoting the opening paragraph of his most famous story, The Call of Cthulhu, first published in Weird Tales in 1928. The most merciful thing in the world, Lovecraft writes, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but one day the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall go mad from the revelation, or flee from the deadly light, into the peace and safety of a new dark age. The theme linking the stories, making up Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, a literary mythology that Lovecraft's fellow Weird Tales writers contributed to, and to which contemporary writers still add today, is that in dim ages past, well before man appeared, the earth was inhabited by strange, monstrous creatures, the great old ones, who were expelled from it, but who yet live on outside, ever ready to take possession of this earth again. The great old ones are terrifying indeed. Cthulhu, him, or itself, is usually described as blasphemous, eldritch, loathsome, or another string of evocative adjectives, and is usually depicted as a kind of winged, tentacled, squid-like monstrosity of enormous size, who resides in the lost city of R'lyeh, sunken beneath the South Pacific. But while the actual beings of the Cthulhu mythos, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, Shub-Niggurath, the Black Goat of 1,000 Young, and the rest, are disturbing indeed, what is truly frightening about Lovecraft's cosmos is that these entities are not, as in traditional horror tales, supernatural, but merely products, like ourselves, of the chance work of accidental evolution in a wholly purposeless universe. In our case, the boundless rearrangement of electrons, atoms, and molecules that constitute the blind but regular mechanical patterns of cosmic activity gave rise to us, and our official values that allow us to live give us the false idea that all in all, the cosmos is a relatively friendly and cozy place. But there we're wrong. The same blind forces that gave rise to us and to Beethoven, Plato, Leonardo da Vinci, the Buddha, and Mother Teresa also gave rise to these loathsome beings for whom we are negligible insects, when we're not mindless slaves or a tasty hors d'oeuvre. What is scary in the best of Lovecraft is this sense that we are ignorant of the truth about reality, like Sartre's Roquentin, and if we only knew, we would be afraid. Lovecraft called his philosophy cosmicism, by which he basically meant that if we truly grasped the size, age, and sheer strangeness of the universe, an idea of which I tried to present earlier in this chapter, we would recognize that human life can play no important part in it, and that we are only temporary residents on a planet whose previous occupants are planning to return. Possibly the earliest proponent of cosmicism, although he didn't use the term, was H.G. Wells, 1866 to 1946, whose novel The War of the Worlds, 1898, tells us that our world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, the Martians, and yet as mortal as his own minds that are to our minds, as ours are to those of the beasts that perish, intellects vast, cool, and unsympathetic. When Lovecraft wrote The Call of Cthulhu, no one had yet thought of a Big Bang. The astronomer Fred Hoyle, an opponent of the idea, coined the phrase in 1949, although Einstein's relativity was seeping into popular consciousness and quantum theory was raising its head. One can imagine contemporary Lovecrafts having a field day with our current cosmologies. And we can say that if there's an anthropic cosmological principle that suggests human life, or at least life like ours, is somehow necessary to the cosmos, Lovecraft's misanthropic principle suggests the exact opposite. Of course, not all fiction written from a cosmic view is as dark as Lovecraft's. His contemporary Olaf Stapledon, 1886 to 1950, for example, took a similar theme, yet didn't use it to scare his readers. Stapleton's Last and First Men, 1930, and Star Maker, 1937, are vast, cosmic future histories in which different races, species, planets, and galaxies arise from and sink into the cosmic depths. But reading Stapledon produces a sense of wonder and exhilaration, not terror. To be fair to Lovecraft, in his last work, he too begins to see that the awareness that it's a big universe can lead to some insights more productive than a need to flee into the safety of a dark age, as his story The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, makes clear. Some of his other misanthropic views also seem to have softened with time. Sadly, by this time, Lovecraft was dying, and the insight came too late for him to make much use of it. It's a tough cosmos out there. Mention of a misanthropic cosmological principle leads us to an insight into Lovecraft's character. He was, by all accounts, an eccentric type, and for most of his life he lived in Providence, Rhode Island, where he was born, doted on by two aunts, and surrounded by the remnants of his childhood. A brief marriage and life in New York proved disastrous. The asexual Lovecraft was not cut out for married life, and the immigrant population of New York offended his prim sensibilities. Lovecraft always fantasized himself as an aristocratic English gentleman of the 18th century, and to share the streets and subways of Brooklyn with Jews, blacks, Italians, Spaniards, and who knows who else was an affront to him. This aristocratic self-image was associated with a sense of an intellectual, or at least a cultural and aesthetic superiority. Lovecraft loathed the modern world, and as one critic has pointed out, we can read his ghoulish stories as a full-out assault on it. He knew that the values that make life meaningful for most of us were sheer illusions. He knew that our sense of being at home in the world was born of sheer ignorance. But unlike the ignorant fools who needed God or some other supernatural reality, and who believed that meaning and purpose were at work in the universe and not mere chance, he was tough enough to face this truth. He detested those fools who weren't, and so he wrote stories of cosmic terror to scare them. The idea that those who embrace chance as the sole force at play in existence are tough enough to do without the illusions the rest of us enjoy is a theme that comes up again and again. Even Lovecraft himself was accused of not quite making the grade. Of one story, The Whisperer in the Darkness, 1931, his biographer, S.T. Joshi, remarks that in it, Lovecraft couldn't quite bring himself to admit that human penetration of the unknown gulfs of the cosmos is anything but an appalling aberration. Often, those who reject meaning and purpose accuse those who look for it of wanting the world to be that way. Who wouldn't, they concede, but of not being strong or honest or brave, etc. enough to face the truth. But it strikes me that the opposite can be just as true, although it rarely gets a mention, that those who embrace meaninglessness and chance want to be seen as tougher or more intelligent, honest, brave, etc., than those who need meaning and purpose. Frequently, the search for or expectation of meaning is seen as a weakness. Yet again, the opposite can be just as true. The embrace of meaninglessness can be an expression of a hunger for superiority, the need to feel more intelligent and strong than the rest of us fools, just as it can be seen as a form of misanthropy, of a dislike of human beings. Both motives seem to me to be at play in the work of John Gray, considered one of the most important social philosophers of our time. Shades of Gray. As in the case of Stephen Hawking's pronouncements on how the universe began, I find myself perplexed as to why John Gray's philosophy has acquired the aura of importance it has, at least for some readers. Prestigious names have sung his praises. For the late novelist J.G. Ballard, Gray's Straw Dogs, Thoughts on Humans and Other Animals, 2002, was the most exciting book since Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. James Lovelock of Gaia fame tells us that Gray forces us to face the mirror and see ourselves as we are. And for the critic Brian Appleyard, whose opinion on other matters I've found cogent, Gray's book was unquestioningly one of the great works of our time. Others have expressed similar appreciation. It may seem aberrant to fly in the face of such universal celebration, but as far as I can tell from reading Gray's books, he's basically a misanthropic pessimist whose pro-nature and pro-animal remarks express little more than an emotional dislike for human beings. This misanthropy is something we've already seen in Lovecraft and is obvious to anyone who reads Sartre, his championing of human freedom notwithstanding. I say I am perplexed by the importance Gray is given because his philosophy seems as grim as Schopenhauer's, who also believed existence was meaningless and expresses a ferocity toward human values reminiscent of the Marquis de Sade. I would even go as far as to say that remarks similar to Gray's anti-human rhetoric have been used in other contexts to justify murder, although I don't believe Gray himself intended his own comments for that purpose. Yet, Gray's dislike of human beings leads me to suspect that he would not be too troubled if some of them quietly disappeared. Sadly, his animosity toward humans is predictably welcome because of our environmental concerns and guilty conscience about our planet. We have such a bad conscience about ourselves that one could say practically anything negative about human beings and be applauded for it as a deep thinker. Concern for the planet, however, can lead us to some troubling places. In Straw Dogs, Gray remarks that from Gaia's, or the Earth's, point of view, human life has no more meaning than the life of a slime mold. When I wrote an article about Gray's idea some years ago, I pointed out that a similar assessment of human importance was championed by Charles Manson, currently serving a life sentence for the murders of Sharon Tate and Rose Marie and Leno LaBianca in 1969. Of the many pseudo-philosophical remarks Manson made, and which were taken seriously by otherwise intelligent people, one was that a scorpion's life was more important than a human's. While in prison, Manson had time to reflect on this insight and to elaborate on its application. According to Manson, people and the system were killing the planet. When Manson's family killed Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, as well as Leno and Rose Marie LaBianca, according to Charlie, they gave their lives and took lives in order to clean up Atwa, the whole life of the earth, in love and concern for brothers and sisters of soul. Atwa is Manson's acronym for air, trees, water, animals, sometimes all the way alive, the name Manson gave to his radical ecological movement, shepherded by himself and 2 members of his family, Lynette Squeaky Fromm and Sandra Good. It may seem unbelievable, but as Nicholas Goodrick Clark points out, in recent decades, Manson has been reinvented as an eco-warrior, and much of his rhetoric is eerily resonant with that of influential eco-groups such as Earth First, the Animal Liberation Front, the Greens, and a good portion of New Age philosophy. The Earth First founder Dave Foreman declared that we are all animals, and agreed with Manson that human life is of no particular importance. An individual human life has no more intrinsic value than an individual grizzly bear. Indeed, some of us would argue that an individual grizzly bear is more important. Although Gray would probably agree with this, I don't believe he would go to the lengths Manson did to make his point. But some of Gray's remarks make clear that being nature-oriented is not all sweetness and light. Whether we want to recognize it or not, there is a dark side to Gaia. Gray's central idea is that humans think they are free, conscious beings, when in truth they are deluded animals, a borrowing from Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, who, in his Genealogy of Morals, 1887, said that man is the sick animal. Nietzsche's Zarathustra called us the cruelest animal as well, a sobriquet with which Gray would no doubt also concur. Free will, morality, and other specifically human concerns are for Gray simply illusions, just as they are for H.P. Lovecraft and the neuroscientists who believe consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon. We are, for Gray, fundamentally a rapacious species, intent on eradicating other forms of life, and we should own up to this and forget all the nonsense about being anything other. Rather than call ourselves Homo sapiens, Gray suggests Homo rapiens. Of course, not everyone agrees with this, and not all critics of this position are weak-kneed spiritual types. At the New Humanist website, where one finds ideas for godless people, Raymond Tallis, a secular humanist philosopher, takes Gray to task for arguing that we're nothing more than animals, a symptom of what Tallis calls Darwinosis. A similar sensibility informs the historian of science Keenan Malick's book, Man, Beast, and Zombie, 2001. Yet, both Tallis and Malick would, I suspect, be surprised to find themselves in the company of a spiritual thinker like the poet Kathleen Raine, 1908 to 2003, who agrees with them and against Gray that nowadays the term human has been inverted to the point of signifying precisely what is least human in us, our bodily appetites, and all that belongs to natural man. All our problems, and those of the planet, according to Gray, stem from our misconceptions about ourselves, and from our inveterate fantasy about being able to transcend the human condition, which, as far as I can tell, is for Gray of the only human character spelled out in the introduction. Gray apparently has no capacity to grasp human greatness, and any reference to it is merely the cue for some remark to cut us down to size. What Maslow's fully human would elicit from him, I can only guess. A glance at any human, he tells us, should be enough to dispel any notion that it is the work of an intelligent being. This remark would not be out of place in the writings of the Romanian arch-pessimist and one-time fascist enthusiast Emil Cioran, 1911 to 1995, the titles of whose books, The Trouble with Being Born, A Short History of Decay, On the Heights of Despair, would not be incongruent with Gray's own. In every man sleeps a prophet. In every man sleeps a prophet, and when he wakes, there is a little more evil in the world. By all evidence, we are in the world to do nothing. So long as man is protected by madness, he functions and flourishes. These are all taken at random from A Short History of Decay, 1949. Cioran's misanthropic reflections are, on first glance, effective, because their aphoristic style has a shock effect, like a sharp jab to the ribs. Prolonged reading, however, reveals their basic hollowness. The same, I think, can be said of Gray's work. Cioran's misanthropy and cynicism about human values paved his way to a profoundly anti-democratic political philosophy that had no qualms about eradicating undesirable human beings, like Jews. The flip side of not liking human beings is not always saving the planet. What seems to raise Gray's ire is the idea that we can in any way be masters of our destiny. In 1957, Julian Huxley, 1887 to 1975, brother of Aldous Huxley and one of the most important biologists of the 20th century, said that the universe was becoming conscious of itself, in a few of us human beings, and that we had been appointed managing director of the biggest business of all, the business of evolution. He made these remarks in an essay entitled Transhumanism in which he expressed his belief that the human species can, if it wishes, transcend itself. For Huxley, this meant man remaining man, but transcending himself by realizing new possibilities of and for his human nature, a sentiment with which I and this book are in accord, although Huxley's term transhumanism has been adopted by proponents of a man-machine merger, with which I am not in sympathy. Huxley even spoke of the cosmic office to which we find ourselves appointed, a phrase with obvious similarity to the idea of ourselves being cosmic caretakers. Gray will have none of this and would, I suspect, greet any idea that we can direct our evolution with derisive scorn. Like Jacques Monod and Lovecraft, Gray sees little but chance at work in ourselves and the world. Not surprisingly, at the beginning of his chapter headed The Human in Stray Dogs, Gray quotes Monod on mankind's desperate efforts to deny its contingency, a favorite word of Sartre's, which expresses, for Sartre at least, the fact that we are in no way essential to the world. Gray's drift. According to Gray, epidemiology and microbiology are better guides to our future than any of our hopes and plans. We are, he tells us, only a current in the drift of genes. Drift is a favorite term of Gray's. He uses it frequently in a more recent book, The Immortalization Commission, 2011, a bewildering attack on the idea that we can in any way cheat death, a theme already well explored in Ernst Becker's equally dour Denial of Death, 1973. Gray repeatedly tells us about the need to learn the lesson of Darwinism, a lesson apparently that Darwin himself didn't quite accept. Darwin never fully accepted the implications of his own theory, an example of Gray being more royal than the king, of his cosmic toughness, and a reference to Darwin's concerns about the human consequences of his dangerous idea. Alfred Wallace, who arrived at the theory of evolution independently but at the same time as Darwin, and who was also one of the first proponents of an anthropic cosmological principle, was highly credulous because he concluded that the human mind could not have developed simply as a result of evolution. Wallace believed in a non-human intelligence and a spiritual world. He was interested in spiritualism and psychic phenomena, and so must, of course, not have had the nerve to accept the truth. Freud, for his part, could never cure himself of his fascination with telepathy. Once again, even a reductionist like Freud was not quite reductionist enough for Gray, and was in need of a cure for his aberrant interests. What's important for Gray isn't whether Darwin's view of evolution, or the canonizing of it by today's neo-Darwinians like Richard Dawkins, is true, or can account for all the facts, but its lesson, which is something we should learn as if we were naughty children. The lesson is simple. Genes drift, like sand dunes, and the difference between a slime mold, a scorpion, and myself is merely the way the sand has shifted. In my case, it produced me. In H.P. Lovecraft's squid-faced Cthulhu. As human beings are the great vandals of the planet, the idea that we could in any way do anything other than go with the flow infuriates Gray. The fact that only a human being can think that his life is less than important than a scorpion's or a slime mold's seems to have escaped Gray. No scorpion or slime mold can think this, and one doubts that they would, if they could. The central argument against Gray's anti-human animus, however, is that if it is the case that we can never be masters of our fate, if we can only drift, then why bother to write a book about it? What possible good could reading Gray's books do if they can't change our destinies, which, according to him, are written in terms of epidemiology and microbiology? If, as he tells us, humans are animals ruled by blind selection and can never hope to control the process of evolution, why bother to point this out? Or better still, if that is the case, then how can we possibly save the planet or do as Gaia says? Or is it that the genetic drift has simply made Gray write his books, as it makes his readers read them? But if that's the case, then drift is drift, no matter what shape the sand dunes are. They're all sand. Or is it that in Gray's case, the drift has miraculously drifted into a dune that happens to be true? This is the problem with all theories that want to explain human action and purposes in terms of blind chance elements, whether it's genetic drift, the ceaseless and boundless rearrangements of electrons, atoms, and molecules, or the Monte Carlo game. If chance is behind everything, it's also behind the idea that it is behind everything, as well as the person or persons who believe that, which suggests that, in all the possible arrangements of things, in your case, chance just happened to hit upon the arrangement that is true. But why should your chance arrangements of atoms or genes or anything else be any more true than mine? The Nobel Prize-winning molecular biologist Francis Crick, 1916 to 2004, co-discoverer of the structure of the DNA molecule, wrote that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. With all due respect, if that is the case, then it is also true of Crick's sorrows, memories, ambitions, identity, and his belief that these things are no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. If my memories are no more than molecules, and Crick's belief that this is true is also no more than molecules, then why are his molecules more true than mine? Molecules are molecules, just as sand is sand, and drift is drift. The philosophers and scientists who make these kind of sweeping statements seem unaware that they undermine any possibility of their being true, which is the only reason we should give them a moment's thought. More than animals. This sort of muddle is not the only thing wrong with Gray's argument. I say argument, but in fact, Gray does not argue. He simply asserts, and in our time, when it is ecologically correct to have a guilty conscience about being human, making the kinds of statements he does has the zeitgeist behind it. We feel so bad about being human that it's difficult to say anything positive about ourselves, or to question the kind of bad-mouthing we receive. I have found that if I do, I am invariably accused of having something against animals and not wanting to save the planet, neither of which is true. In our anarchic times, filled with very real ecological, social, and political threats, it is satisfying to have a scapegoat on whom to pin the blame. For Gray, that's us, but it's also dangerous. We've seen how close some of Gray's remarks are to those of an ecologically correct, convicted killer. I agree that we face enormous challenges. I'd be an idiot if I didn't. And that many of our crises are of our own making, and that we need to grow beyond our short-sighted selfishness. But I don't think throwing our humanity out with the bathwater is the best way to go about this. One of Gray's mistakes is to believe that we were all happy with being animals until Christianity arrived. This is not true. As soon as we became self-conscious, we realized we were somehow different from the other creatures around us, and the history of the human mind has been more or less as unpacking of that of intuition. For thousands of years, human beings have felt and acted as if they were something more than animals. Every religion is in some way about this, and there were religions before Christianity. We always knew we had an animal nature. That isn't in doubt, but we didn't believe it summed us up completely. It is, in fact, only since the rise of science, and specifically of Darwinian evolution, and the crude, materialist reductionism born of them, that we've had the idea that we are only animals force-fed us, with the best intentions, no doubt. Whether it is selfish genes or naked apes, it is only in the last few centuries that we have come to see ourselves as sick, deluded, cruel, rapacious, you can pick the adjective of your choice, animals, formed not in the image of God, Nu, or the Ein Sof, but of drifting matter. And, as Kathleen Rain has pointed out, the world has never been more hideous, more uninhabitable than the world created by an ideology that proclaims that this world is all, which gives to matter a primacy and all importance unknown to other civilizations. With the corollary that, as Colin Wilson writes, speaking of today, it is probably true to say that there has never been a point in human history when humankind had a more depressing view of itself. This has been The Caretakers of the Cosmos, Living Responsibly in an Unfinished World, written by Gary Lockman, narrated by Russell Newton. Copyright 2013 by Flores Books. Production copyright by Spoken Tome Media. You need to hear this.